Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to this installment of Context Clues, where we provide you with excerpts from previous episodes to help make our new topic at hand a little bit richer. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. Those of you who know me well, who have been longtime listeners, know that cryptids are just not my bag, baby. This may seem incongruous with the rest of my interests, folklore, urban legends, conspiracy theories, but I don't know. Those little monsters just don't spark joy within me. But we received a message on our Urban Legends Hotline asking me to investigate the Jersey Devil, a winged creature said to live deep in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, causing all kinds of calamities for the local population, stretching back 300 years. So I started looking into the story and, to my glee, found that the roots of this tale did spark joy, in the way that weird Puritan and Quaker history and elaborate circus hoaxes always do for me. The Jersey Devil folklore I discovered had old-school socio-political roots, much more than just a goofball creature that goofballs are hunting for out in the dense pine barrens of the Northeast. So then I got excited to tell you all about the fascinating, meandering, folkloric components that came together to form one of the weirdest cryptids out there, and to explain why I think it's all still relevant today. We are going to get into this collection of context clues right after this. As I was putting together our Jersey Devil episode, I was struck with the weird historical similarities between the evolution of our titular cryptid and some other beasts of yore, the cannibal pig people that we covered on an early Urban Legends Hotline episode. Sightings of pig people have taken place all over the country, and they each have their own unique lore to go with them. Just like the mythical pig people, the seeds of what would become the legend of the Jersey Devil were planted all the way back in the early years of what would become America, when the East Coast was being colonized by Puritans and Quakers. As we know, the 1600s were a deeply superstitious and anxiety-ridden era, where witches and devils lurked in the woods, and even more frighteningly, lurked among those who considered themselves the righteous. This religious panic led to the Salem witch trials, of course, but it also led to much stranger ideas about how the punishments of God and the tricks of the devil might work in the material world. When it comes to the Jersey Devil, part of the story we will hear in our upcoming episode is about what the Puritans called, unfortunately, a monstrous birth. One in which an infant or fetus is born with a visible congenial disability. Without the progression of science that would come in the next centuries, the deeply religious communities saw these births as punishments from God for the sins of the mother. But ideas about these monstrous births extended to the non-human world as well, and when their farm animals produced progeny with congenial issues, that was taken as a bad omen as well. Around the same time that the earliest form of the Jersey Devil was taking shape through a sensationalized trial against women that we'll learn about in our upcoming episode, a panic was also ensuing against the sins of men as well. And let's just say it was a lot weirder. Also contained within the following is a circus hoax that bears a striking similarity to one we will be discussing next week. So now please enjoy this excerpt from our 2023 Urban Legends Hotline episode called The Cannibal Pig People of Pig Hill. As is the case with most contemporary myths, we can look to several other stories that share common traits with the legend of Pig Hill. Deep in the very secluded eastern edge of the Florida Everglades, there lives a half-feral community of around 50 squallies, as they're known to Floridians, described as short people the size of a child, each with the snout of a pig, and each with a taste for human flesh. The reason these pig people exist is explained by locals in several different variations. A government science experiment gone horribly wrong, or like the monsters of Pig Hill, generations of inbreeding, or even as the result of ongoing bestiality with the wild hogs that roam the area. But these pig-faced cannibals don't always arrive in a family clan. Some are lonely boogeymen who haunt the deserted rural roads outside of town, often attacking teenagers who parked for a little heavy petting privacy. The Pigman of Northfield, Vermont, is said to haunt a lover's lane known to locals as the Wash Bowl. A story circulated in the 1970s that a group of teenagers were hanging out and drinking beer there after attending a high school dance when they heard the nearby bushes begin to rustle, and suddenly they saw what looked like a tall human covered in white hair, sporting an unmistakable pig face. So they ditched the beer and ran screaming back down to the high school. In the halls of said high school, a backstory to the legend was born, a tale of a teenager named Sam Harris, who disappeared in 1951 on the evening before Halloween to participate in Mischief Night, a carton of eggs tucked under his arm. When he wasn't home by the next morning, the town gathered to scour the area for the missing boy, but he was never found. Lovers laners have long claimed to have seen or even been attacked by this beast wielding an axe, a rotted pig head covering his face. Others believe that Sam grew a propensity for bestiality and fathered some human-pig hybrids that now lurk in the dark woods beyond the high school, who come to attack the students who dare to trespass. Similarly, the Pigman of Texas's Bonnie Bay Bridge is said to reside as a hermit under or around the structure, attacking teens who park nearby, either wearing a pig's head over his own or with an unexplained pig-like countenance. Another bridge haunted by yet another Pigman is in rural Hawkinsville, Georgia, and another in rural South Alabama, and yet another in rural Millington, Tennessee. But perhaps the most famous example of the Pigman legend comes out of Angola, New York, where a much more detailed telling exists. Like the tales we talked about at length in our first Urban Legends Hotline episode about the ghost children of Munger Road, this legend is connected to a horrific train crash nicknamed the Angola Horror that took place in 1867. As the story goes, two teenage brothers named Henry and Loring collected some rail ties off a track to fix their fence, which led to a catastrophic train derailment, with most of the cars falling into the gorge below. Fearing negative publicity, the actions of the brothers were hidden by the town, and they returned to live on their run-down farm on Holland Road. Years later, Loring married a woman named Betsy Crabtree, whose parents had been cousins, and at 19, she gave birth to their son, Bill. Bill was born with frontonasal dysplasia, which meant that the two sides of his face were not fully connected. He had a split nose and widely separated eyes, giving him the distinct look, locals said, quite unkindly, of a pig. Growing up, the outcast Bill worked odd jobs to help out his destitute family, but his looks kept him unemployed, save for a stint working with a local butcher. There were also reports that Bill's unique face landed him a job with a traveling circus as a sideshow freak. It was rumored that he then married his first cousin Mildred, giving birth to a son and two daughters who shared a similar pig-like face. Bill started to work for a local sanitation company near their long-term home on Holland Road, likely helping the legend come into being as he stalked around the dump wearing a hood, giving instructions to those disposing of their garbage in barely intelligible sentences. Eventually, the dump closed down, which meant not only that Bill lost his only source of income, but also that the area around his home became all but abandoned. This isolated spot became a perfect place for suburban teenagers to park their cars, to drink and make out, far from the purview of the local police. This angered poor Bill, and he decided to do something about it. He started by driving his old rusty truck up behind the parked cars, intimidating them until they pulled off, giving them a glimpse of his porcine features. When that didn't work, he got more extreme, leaving the severed heads of pigs on stakes as a warning to trespassers, and then replacing those heads with the heads of teenagers who dared to breach his borders. Or so the legend goes. There is virtually no evidence to support any of this. But don't worry, everybody. Our dear femmes are represented too. Pig Lady Road in Hillsborough, New Jersey is said to be haunted by the ghost of the pig-faced lady. The main version told about this isolated stretch of rural road is that a pig farmer's wife gave birth to a daughter who was disfigured in a way that resembled a hog, leading her cruel father to cut the head off one of his swines and force her to wear it over her face. After her mother's death, the girl killed her father with an axe and then went on to kill two teenage boys who left a pig head on her doorstep to make fun of her facial deformities. Legend has it that her ghost still stalks those who park on the secluded road, coming after them with the same axe. Looking back at the earlier freak shows of the 1800s, we will meet many pig-faced women of whom Charles Dickens claimed, quote, "No fair was complete without one." It's certain that variations of the pig-faced woman toured through England and Ireland throughout the century, and we can assume that she was exported to the United States as well, either literally in the many touring freak shows or through stories passed on through the innumerable English and Irish immigrants who came to America around that time. But unlike our pig-faced man Bill, the pig-faced woman was not actually a woman at all. She was a bear that had been shaved completely, that had been put into a wig and a dress, outfitted with fake breasts, with shoes attached to its back paws, and with white gloves attached to its front paws. Tied to a chair, the audience was allowed to ask yes or no questions, and the bear was poked with a stick in order to elicit answers in the form of grunts. The audience would then watch this pig-faced woman eat hungrily out of a silver trough. This sort of human-pig hybrid presented to a gullible audience may be ridiculous, but perhaps even more ridiculous was the early Puritans' fear of the true potential of such a monstrosity. On February 14th, 1642, a planter by the name of John Wakeman went to the New Haven, Connecticut magistrates to make a truly strange but very serious accusation. He said that he had in his possession a
prodigious monster,
a stillborn piglet given birth to by a sow he had just purchased. He went on to describe the abomination like this.
It had no hair on the whole body. The skin was very tender and of a reddish-white color like a child's. The head was most strange. It had but one eye in the middle of the face, and that large and open, like some blemished eye of a man. Over the eye, in the bottom of the forehead, which was like a child's, a thing of flesh grew forth and hung down. It was hollow, and like a man's instrument of generation. A nose, mouth, and chin deformed, but not much unlike a child's. The neck and ears also had such resemblance.
John Wakeman was accusing a man of bestiality, what they called copulating with strange flesh, a capital sin in Puritan colonies, by claiming that he had fathered a human-piglet hybrid. His proof was that the prodigious monster looked suspiciously like a servant named George Spencer, who worked for the man who had sold him the sow. He claimed that his disfigured face matched that of the piglet. Quote,
his deformed eye being beheld and compared together with the eye of the monster, seemed to be as like the eye in the glass to the eye in the face.
When the accusations started to fly, it's important to note that George Spencer was already known in town as a troublemaker, punished at one point for stealing goods in Boston and trying to escape his indentured servitude by fleeing to Virginia. Not only that, but George was guilty of not giving a fuck about the Christian God, openly telling people that the sermons of their famous minister, John Davenport, just didn't do it for him. He also told his fellow colonists that in the 5 years he had resided in New England, he had uttered not a single prayer, and that he only ever cracked open the Bible when his master forced him to by threat of punishment. He was not well liked in the community, and his lowly status made him an easy target. When the official investigation began, George Spencer strongly denied the accusation, but the magistrates locked him up on suspicion after they took a look at the evidence. While imprisoned, the magistrate approached George and chastised him for his ungodly actions, but he would not admit to the crime. That is, until he was badgered with some unnerving Bible quotes about his abominable behavior and a warning that he better confess his sin lest he face the wrath of God. Likely knowing that repentance was a powerful Puritan path to avoid being hanged, he confessed that he had indeed laid with the pig in the biblical sense. But once he confessed, instead of gaining his freedom, they told him he would be put to death. So he flipped, and then flipped back again, trying to find whatever formula he could to placate the outraged community and save his literal neck. But it was all to no avail. He was hanged 2 months after the birth of the piglet, and the sow, as if she were guilty too, was killed with a sword, a common practice with convictions of bestiality. Whether George Spencer indeed committed this crime or was pressured into making a false confession will never truly be known. But based on the bad evidence of the pig baby, this was officially the first recorded wrongful execution in Connecticut's history, as well as the very first recorded false confession in colonial America. Great start, boys. 10 out of 10. At this time, there was actually a full-blown, but now largely forgotten, moral panic over bestiality. A bit of a pre-Salem witch trials witch hunt. This one focused mainly on male servants. Almost all of those accused were poor teenage boys and young men without family ties in the area. Another well-documented case involved 2 more deformed piglets that people thought looked suspiciously like the servant of another household. His name, and you're not gonna believe it, was Thomas Hogg. He denied the charge fervently, but he still sat in prison for months awaiting trial, which is when things got super hella weird, just like our modern era, in which those hunting for alleged perverts often appear to be the weird perverts themselves. The prosecution brought him to the sow in question and made him fondle her until, quote, immediately there appeared a working lust in the sow. But when he was forced to do the same thing to a second pig, she had no reaction. Even fucking weirder, Thomas Hogg had a hernia that forced him to wear a steel truss, which kept cutting his pants wide open, and his scrotum became sort of well known in the general community, leading someone to say that one of the piglet's eyes looked like his scrotum, which I think is bad science, even for Puritans. Thomas never confessed, and thus was never hanged, but the scarlet letter of the pig-fucking accusation followed him for life. This bestiality moral panic, which extended to animals beyond pigs, got so dramatic that women took on all of the milking duties. And if a man even wanted to enter a barn, he better have both a really good excuse and he better go along with the chaperone. But after a while, all men were suspect, even those who came from richer backgrounds. And as the moral panic began to affect the more privileged of the communities, just like magic, it slowly died out. Imagine that. The historical roots of the Jersey Devil can help us understand how the cryptid came together in the way that it did, its backstory and its looks. But those roots don't explain how the creature went wildly viral, second only to Bigfoot. You all know how dearly American hysteria loves a well-executed hoax, one that illuminates something about the culture at the time and what it is ready to believe and why. The evolution of the Jersey Devil is a story of one such hoax, though the details of it are disturbing enough for me to be pretty mad about it, but we'll get into that next week. For this next section of context clues, we can look at another hoax that, like the Jersey Devil story, gripped the East Coast and later the country at large, both using fake stories planted in newspapers. In fact, I would guess that the tactics used to popularize the Jersey Devil 70 years later may have taken inspiration from the story you're about to hear. So please enjoy this excerpt on the Great Moon Hoax from our 2020 episode called Fake News. Way back in August of 1835, a fledgling daily paper called the New York Sun was making waves as one of America's first penny papers, covering stories of public interest rather than the boring financial and political reports of the day. These papers, like the New York Times, were too expensive for the working class to afford and often contained content that just didn't relate to their lives. And so the penny press filled the gap, focusing instead on entertainment and leaving the political humdrum out of it. True crime proved a popular topic, of course, but soon editors realized that other kinds of stories sold just as well, the kind of stories that seemed to pique our interest in a similar vein to murder. Stories of the strange and unusual, the paranormal, freak oddities like P.T. Barnum used to display, sheep with 3 eyes and snakes with 2 heads. But the Sun gained its first real burst of notoriety when the paper published a 6-part series called Celestial Discoveries that would come to be known as the Great Moon Hoax. The articles alleged, in a serious scientific manner, that the moon was teeming with advanced life and offered drawings of what had apparently been discovered by the famous astronomer Sir John Herschel with a completely made-up telescope of unimaginable power. And allegedly, and we must include this, as the creation was completed, a scientist reportedly said to Herschel,
"Thou art the man!"
Over a period of 6 days, conveniently following America's first sighting of Halley's Comet, they rolled the story out in a sensational fashion to a wild buzz, with newsboys hollering cinematically on the street corners about this revolutionary discovery. It went like this. The moon was not the lonely hanging rock that America knew, but instead it was full of familiar sights, rivers, lakes, even oceans with sandy beaches, huge temples of beautiful blue stone with golden roofs, even one that was abandoned and perpetually surrounded by flames, with a scattering of familiar-looking pyramids. And then there was the wildlife. Miniature zebras and bison, beavers that walked like people and made huts and were able to build fires, and even large blue goat-like unicorns. The advanced beings of the moon were referred to as man-bats and were just that, a hybrid of a man and a bat, mostly like real hard-bodied, hairy men with bat wings. And these creatures mated publicly without modesty and appeared to be conscious and sentient, and also vegetarians. After the first installment, the Sun's readership increased 2.5-fold and would become the most widely read in the entire world. And this wasn't just a fun paranormal rabbit hole for a handful of people to go down for an afternoon. Though it's difficult to ascertain the scope of the belief in this goofy tale, there is evidence to suggest that a truly notable number of readers took it to be true. In Kurt Andersen's book Fantasyland, he quotes an editor, perhaps speaking a little hyperbolically, of a different local newspaper.
All New York rang with the wonderful discoveries. To express a doubt on the genuineness of the great lunar discoveries was considered almost as heinous a sin as to question the truth of revelation.
In classic fashion, the next step was the grand expose, the fraud revealed. At the time, the Sun's greatest competitor was James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald, a publication that would have likely been able to skewer the moon story faster had its offices not burned to the ground the very week of the story's premiere. But by the end of the month, the Herald found the vital comeback it needed in a lengthy article titled The Astronomical Hoax Explained, in which the Sun editor, Richard Adams Locke, one of the industry's first beat crime journalists, was revealed as the author and called out for creating a hysteria with his fake news. There would be reports years later that Locke was actually a satirist who was basically making fun of some of the loonier scientific assertions of the day, especially those made by the man he called the Christian philosopher, who claimed that there were billions of inhabitants living on the moon. There were people out there talking seriously on the matter of moon people, and then there were the people making fun of that as well. And it reminds me of a Puritan story that also made a serious splash in the boredom of colonial America.
The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So the Lord said,
I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them.
In 1705, in a small town in New York called Claverack that was set along the Hudson River, the story goes like this. On a leisurely stroll, a Dutch farmer felt something like a rock knock against his boot, something that had been rolling down the hill beside him. And when he picked it up to examine it, he was flabbergasted to realize he was holding a tooth the size of his fist. But without hesitation, he traded the tooth to a local politician for a glass of rum straight up. The tooth was then gifted to Lord Cornbury, the quirky and flamboyant governor of the state, who made a big old to-do about it all, and through digging in the area, more huge bones would be discovered. But without even the notion that the Earth could have been more than 6,000 God-fearing years old, they wouldn't have guessed that it was actually an extinct species. Well, at least, not a biological one. Perhaps out of an actual belief, and perhaps out of a beneficial political agenda, or both, Lord Cornbury wrote on a slip of paper, "Tooth of a giant," just below the passage of Genesis that stated, approximately, there were giants in the earth in the days before the flood. At the time, it was a serious flex against their British rivals that America would be the true home of these biblical beefcakes. Oh, and here he comes. Watch out. You think you wouldn't slime in for a piece of the action? That's right. Puritan minister and witch trial bitch Cotton Mather was there to pridefully boast about the bones and said that compared to the American supergiants, European giants
must hardly be so much as pygmies.
But then the more liberal side of the spectrum got in on that fake news action 150 years later, as the popular myth was still hanging around despite scientific refutations, with one atheist all puffed up about these ridiculous claims. After getting in a yelling fight with a reverend, George Hull thought it was time to punk the delusional revivalists, as he sat, quote, wondering why people would believe those remarkable stories in the Bible about giants, when suddenly I thought of making a stone giant and passing it off as a petrified man. The finished giant had been made from quarry rock, allegedly for a statue of Lincoln, and Hull hired a stone cutter to sculpt a 3,000-pound hoax, spending the equivalent of $50,000, and then he buried it in Cardiff, New York, left it there for a year for authenticity, and then hired people to discover it while digging a well. He swore them to secrecy. Thousands poured into Cardiff to get a glimpse of what the papers were calling a new wonder. After making some cash on tickets, Hull sold the giant, and it went on the road with its new owner. But within a few months, people began realizing it was all fake, a hoax to expose the ridiculousness of the Christian version of science, and also to make a bunch of cash at the same time. P.T. Barnum would go on to copy the Cardiff Giant, and it would influence his Weekly World Newsian oddities as he spread similar stories all over the country, continuing to prop up the American idea that anything and everything is possible, and often preferable to everyday life. More after this. And now, back to the show. For our last little segment here on Context Clues, I'm excited to share an excerpt from what remains one of my all-time favorite episodes, very generally titled Urban Legends. It was an episode that took a kind of meta look at how the study of urban legends came to be, as well as how my own deep love of these tall tales materialized. Spoiler alert, I believe the Jersey Devil to be one such urban legend, or rather, a mythology that carried over from early America all the way into the present day. It reminded me of another urban legend that I was told by my mom when I was growing up, one that she experienced herself while living on the East Coast as a kid, and you'll actually get to hear her tell it in a moment. As for the Urban Legends episode, I was finally able to really dig into this tale that I had heard so many times, and what I uncovered was absolutely fascinating as usual. Like the Jersey Devil story that we'll hear next week, the Bunny Man was partially a creation of the ideas about rural areas outside the city and what monsters might lurk there, human or otherwise. This section is also a great example of how research into an urban legend works, and like the archivist in this story, I try to do the same kind of investigation to find the roots of these stories, though our Jersey Devil tale goes a whole lot farther back than the Bunny Man legend. So please enjoy this excerpt from our 2021 episode called Urban Legends. When I was growing up, my mom told me a sensational story, one that had allegedly happened in her East Coast town when she was 10 years old. And so I asked her to tell us a little bit of that story as she remembers it.
I remember it being 1972, and we were living in Maryland at Heather Hill Apartments. And I had a good friend. Her name may or may not have been Denise. And we used to walk to school. And one day we walked to school, and I was going to spend the night with her that night. And she said to me, "Have you heard about the Bunny Man?" And she told me that he had murdered people, numerous people, and that he would dress in a bunny outfit and he would murder them with a hatchet. So we were freaked out, and the whole school knew about it, and they were all freaked out. So that night, I spent the night with Denise and whoever her other friend was. And we went outside and played, and, it was getting dark, and we were scared to death, but we were also thrilled at the possibility that there could be a Bunny Man sighting. And, that's all I remember, but it was a big topic of conversation at school for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Around the same time, when he was a teenager in Fairfax County, Virginia, a historian and archivist named Brian A. Conley also heard the story of the Bunny Man while sitting around a campfire. It creeped him out enough to keep him out of the woods, but it went dormant in his imagination for almost 15 years until after college, when he took a job at the Fairfax County Public Library. One day, a woman asked him to help her find information on 2 local murders in which children had apparently been hanged from a bridge by a hermit punishing them for trespassing. The last bit of information that she had was that the man had perhaps escaped from prison or escaped from an insane asylum and was always wearing what appeared to be a bunny suit. Brian immediately recalled the story of the Bunny Man that he'd been told when he was young, but he still figured it to just be a local boogeyman story meant to scare misbehaving children. He almost forgot about the rumors again, but in fact, he couldn't, because all through the 1990s, people were talking about this floppy-eared psychopath, about the county's alleged roster of missing children, about dead bodies hung from bridges and rabbits turned inside out. Fox even included the location in their primetime special that I'm certain I must have watched, Scariest Places on Earth, with a segment called Terror on the Bunnyman's Bridge. This bridge was a huge fixture in the story, and it's actually called the Colchester Overpass, the location of many supposed murders and the subsequent paranormal activity. The locals had become angry about it, as teens partied there and spray-painted profanities, tried to scare each other with pranks, and probably did what was assumed to be occult shit. The rural community would actually get the cops to set up a checkpoint before the bridge that Halloween, not allowing anyone to get near the site. And each person that tried to reach that bridge, and some came from the next state over, brought along with them their own lurid lore, personalized versions of the story from their own research on early internet message boards. Some told of that escaped inmate or patient that was prowling the area, eating rabbits raw and then hanging their inside-out corpses from trees, and then eventually killing and hanging a local man from the tree, and then eventually several children from the bridge. Brian Conley, living in the heart of all of this, must have reached a curiosity tipping point and committed himself to the Bunnyman legend, and being the archivist he was, began digging up everything he could to find the source of the story. When he was young, the victims were at most 2 local kids, and now some claimed up to 32 murders could be traced to this Bunnyman. And then Brian found a website called Castle of Spirits in 1999, in which the author claimed that a group of patients from the local insane asylum had indeed broken out, and then one killed another, and then that killer became the Bunnyman, leading to the gruesome deaths of several local people, and this site was complete with names, dates, locations, and a dare to visit the Clifton Town Library, where all of this could apparently be verified. But not so, said Brian Conley, king of the archives, and he easily debunked all of it. And then he and those who he was working with researched every murder they could find throughout the local area from 1872 all the way to 1973, when the legend first became well established. They found no mention of bunnies or anything that meaningfully resembled the Bunnyman urban legend. And then that was it. The trail pretty much went cold. But then one day, he was casually looking at some collected accounts about the Bunnyman legend from the Maryland Folklore Archive, and he noticed that 1970 was when one student claimed that they had first heard the tale. And then, eureka. The 2 incidents that most likely ignited the legend appeared to have happened in October 1970 in Burke, Virginia, 10 days apart, with actual reports of attacks or threats from a man wearing a bunny suit and wielding a hatchet. The first was an account actually printed by the Washington Post in the days before Halloween, titled "Man in Bunny Suit Sought in Fairfax." It was about an Air Force cadet who claimed that he and his fiancée were parked along a rural road to visit an uncle, when suddenly the front passenger side window was smashed by a man wearing a white bunny suit with long ears who yelled that they were on private property. And after they drove away, they found the implement used to attack them, a hatchet on the floor of their car. Allegedly, during police questioning, the fiancée of the cadet gave a different account. She said that the man wasn't wearing a bunny suit, but that he was wearing something that kind of looked like a pillowcase over his head, or possibly a white hood. The second report came from a security guard who confronted a man standing on the porch of a half-built home at a construction site, who, the guard said, was wearing a black, white, and gray bunny suit and was chopping at the railing with an axe, calling out,
"You are trespassing. If you come any closer, I'll chop your head off."
As the local media, as well as the Washington Post, began spreading these stories, headlines like "Bunny Man Seen" and "Bunny Reports Are Multiplying" alleged that in just a few weeks there had been over 50 sightings, and many said he was coming after children. This was right around the time when my mom began hearing the story. And decades later, the Bunny Man myth would still survive that thorough debunking work of Brian Conley. Excellent work, Brian. And by 2011, there would be a low-budget horror movie called Bunny Man. These sensational local legends exist in towns all over the country. They're relatively harmless, and some psychologists believe them to be beneficial, another way for young people to explore their real fears through myth-making. But of course, once the parents get their mitts on something we love, it gets fucked up real fast. Well, folks, that's going to do it for this installment of Context Clues. Come back next week for our episode called The Jersey Devil. In the meantime, you can check out the full episodes from today: The Cannibal Pig People of Pig Hill, Fake News, and Urban Legends. You can also go to AmericanHysteria.com and leave us a message of your own on our Urban Legends Hotline about a tale you'd like us to investigate. I promise you'll get way more than you asked for. This was American Hysteria. If you want to support our show and make sure we can continue making it, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get ad-free episodes as well as access to Hysteria Home Companion, another podcast that I do with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories connected to the topics we cover or stories we know that you'll love. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. Another great way to help us out is to leave us a 5-star review on the app of your choosing. It really helps us out. Seriously, you could do it right now. It'd be real easy. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler, and our sound designer and associate producer is Riley Swedelius Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope that you're hanging in there and that you have the best week you possibly can.